but I'm just giving you insight into really the level of detail I provide as I'm explaining these types of tests. And usually when I go through these one by one, clients' eyes are really like getting big and they're like, oh my God, like you're describing exactly the symptoms I'm having. And you're like validating how I've been feeling, which is really great. I mean, a lot of times they've been to the doctor, they might have been to some other practitioners that haven't been able to literally run tests and directly correlate what they're finding on the tests back to the literal symptoms they're having. And this can just be so, it can be such a relief, right? Welcome to Resolve IBS and IBD Naturally. I'm Courtney Cowie, a nutrition therapy and functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner. If you are struggling with the symptoms of IBS or IBD and want to get to the root cause of your symptoms so you can take back your health through a whole person approach, this podcast is for you. Just a disclaimer that the information I'm presenting in this podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be taken as medical advice. You should always consult a qualified practitioner before making any changes to your health or medical regimen. That being said, let's get on with the show. I want to actually share a client case study with you today. I did a survey a few weeks ago asking about just interest around different topics. And a lot of you, by the way, thank you for completing that. Those who did had indicated that you're really interested in functional testing, potentially wanting to understand that better, wanting to have a better handle on what these functional tests look like and how I essentially look at these things and assess them as a practitioner. So I thought it would be really helpful to, at least for the next few months, take a client and kind of, change the name to protect their identity a bit, but show you some real people that I've worked with who are struggling with GI symptoms and autoimmune symptoms, as well as potentially other things, and what their testing has shown me, so that hopefully you can get deeper insight into what this process looks like, if this is something you're considering. And maybe some of these people will actually really resonate and you'll see yourself in some of their symptoms. So I'm sharing my screen just to show you the first client case today. This is my client, Melissa, who essentially came to me, and she had already been to a functionally trained medical doctor, I should mention this, and had gotten some help, had gotten a little better from that practitioner's approach, but there were definitely still some gaps. And in the beginning, when I sat down with her, I could tell she was having a lot of brain fog. She was having trouble kind of getting to the ends of her sentences and, continuing the conversation on some level. Like, it was taking a lot of concentration and thought, and also even just putting words to the symptoms she was experiencing. But specifically, she was really struggling in the morning. That part of her day was absolutely terrible. And she described it as having a lot of stomach sort of issues, specifically nausea. Like, she felt like she just couldn't eat. And if she tried to eat, she'd feel really, really sick, like she was going to vomit. Having a lot of fatigue sometimes. This would actually happen throughout the day, including in the afternoon as well. But just the state of her stomach and the state of, I think, her brain and how she felt overall in the morning, it was absolutely the worst. And so initially we kind of sat down and talked about that. And I got a handle on what this other practitioner had done and said, from my perspective, there's definitely some gaps and some pieces of information that haven't really been looked at and gathered for you. And I feel like I can help you, and I feel like I could provide you with some deeper insight on some areas that you haven't gotten to date. And so she agreed. So I'm showing you actually here a part of her GI map, which is the stool test that I really love, that I run on pretty much all of my clients. And I run this test because it's just so great for a bunch of data. Like, it looks at the gamut of potential pathogens and microbes that we may or may not want in the gut. It also looks at intestinal health. And so I'm not going to go over this really super, super detailed. I would do that if this was a client session. If this was your test, I would take a lot of time and really go through this. But I just want to give you a visual and sort of explain at a high level why this test is super important, and at least in her case, what it revealed that started to get her some answers and help me formulate a plan that ultimately helped her to start to feel better over time. So if we look at her test, the first thing that's showing up actually is this factor here. Helicobacter or H. pylori, and hopefully you can see my cursor moving on the screen. If not, it's right in the middle of the left-hand side of the screen. This is a type of pathogenic bacteria that if it shows up in any amount on a GI map, I'm automatically suspicious, especially with someone who's got complex picture of health issues going on, lots of symptoms, and potentially more than one system of the body impacted. Any GI stuff, any brain issues, hands down, I'm already thinking, yep, this could definitely be playing a role. And so that was notable. And that was a piece of her map to getting her health to a better level. Looking down below that, we've got this normal bacterial flora section. And this is essentially several of the what we call keystone species of bacteria in the gut. These are the guys we want to see in the gut, but we want them in the right amount. We don't want them too low and we don't want them too high. And so this is kind of looking at where these different bacterial species falling out within an optimal range. And you can see the optimal range is over here to the right. And so this is pretty intuitive. The GI map is flagging 3 of these specific keystone species as high. So we've got some overgrowth, which can be a bad thing even for the bacteria we want in the gut. And it's also showing me that one of her 2 phyla, which are essentially the 2 main classes of bacteria in the gut, in her case, Bacteroidetes, is also elevated. So just in general, I would summarize this as some overgrowth of the body's commensal bacteria. The GI map isn't a gold standard definitive test for small intestinal bacteria overgrowth, which is, if you're not familiar with that, a condition that the vast majority of people with gut symptoms turn out to have on some level. It's, correlated with upwards of like 70 to 80% of IBS, as well as a high percentage of autoimmune disease as well. And, this isn't the test that I would use definitively to determine does this person have SIBO or not. But when I'm starting to see quite a bit of overgrowth and then 1 or more of these phyla elevated, that's making me start to suspect it and think about that as a possibility in terms of her symptom and burden load, right? If we look at the opportunistic bacteria, we're also seeing here 3 species coming out high. Now, generally, these are strains of bacteria we really don't want to be seeing much at all in the gut, but I pay attention if they're coming out in the red and they're coming out high. And, each of these different species, I should mention as well, are correlated with different physical symptoms in the body. And this is something that I actually take the time to go through species by species and explain to the client, hey, when bacillus is elevated, it's a histamine producer. You could have high histamine symptoms, and that might look like headaches or even having skin reactions or diarrhea after you eat, for example, right? I won't take the time to do that just here because, again, this isn't an actual client session we're doing, but I'm just giving you insight into really the level of detail I provide as I'm explaining these types of tests. And usually when I go through these one by one, clients' eyes are really like getting big and they're like, oh my God, like you're describing exactly the symptoms I'm having. And you're like validating how I've been feeling, which is really great. I mean, a lot of times they've been to the doctor, they might have been to some other practitioners that haven't been able to literally run tests and directly correlate what they're finding on the tests back to the literal symptoms they're having. And this can just be so, it can be such a relief, right? And then also encouraging that they feel like, oh, thank God somebody's finally getting it and this person could offer me a plan to get well. That's a huge sense of hope, right, at the same time. If we look at the parasite section, she actually had a parasite actually come back as well. And the one specifically was Blastocystis hominis. And this guy in particular can be kind of tricky to eradicate. And I always explain to clients if I find this particular bug, this could sometimes take up to 6 months to get rid of. So again, having these nuances and this insight as a practitioner who's done this many times with a client who knows this test inside out, who knows and understands the different microbes that show up on this test, this can really be helpful in giving clarity and setting expectations about timelines for how long it might take to start to feel better and to start to get over the hump. Just in general, I know I haven't explained everything in the test yet, but with Melissa's test, this is really a great example to be showing you today because I don't often see this many different issues to work on co-simultaneously on a test. So I'll often see bacterial counts out of range. I'll often see H. pylori. I don't often see a parasite sometimes, right? And I may or may not see candida. Often it isn't showing up on a stool test, but in her case there was just so much going on, like so much going on, like almost an exceptional amount, which again was validating, but also allowed me to kind of set some expectations around like this could very well take 6 to 9 months to fully work through, depending on how quickly your body responds, how diligent you are with diet, how much rest you're giving yourself, and how much you're working to kind of support a healing state for your body, right? Like everyone's going to be a little bit different, but this is definitely an example of what I would consider a more layered case where there's definitely a lot of healing opportunities we're finding that are going to take some time and some work and some patience. In the fungi yeast section, she's also showing positive and high for candida. And what's interesting about that is that stool testing in general is not very sensitive to candida, which is why if I suspect candida after I've done an initial consult with a client and I'm considering, all right, which tests am I going to recommend we order if they move forward with me, I will almost always run a blood spot to check candida antibodies that way because it's much more accurate, it's much more sensitive. Stool testing can miss it. However, as you can see, there are definitely times where it comes back positive, and that just tells me this is at a high enough and systemic enough level that it's showing positive in a stool test. So this is definitely a big area for her in terms of healing opportunity that, we want to address. Now, the other thing to kind of note about this particular test is, again, as I mentioned, there's a lot going on here. And especially when I see candida elevated at this level, plus all of these different microbes that are present or, growing out of range or essentially proliferating, I also simultaneously start to suspect mold toxicity simply because this is an area of specialty for me. I always, am assuming that a person who's chronically been struggling with IBS or any kind of autoimmune symptom picture, a quarter of those people on average are likely to be mold toxic clients, that it's that common in the population. And that has a lot to do with just prevalence of different genotypes, these HLA genotypes that are tied to immune system function. It's been shown through Richie Shoemaker's work, who's one of the pioneering doctors in the field of mold toxicity, that about a quarter of the population, or even potentially a little more, carries certain HLA gene types that if they get activated, it makes it more difficult for them to eliminate mold toxins. But just tying this into functional testing and specifically the GI map, I do start to get a little suspicious when I see this type of presentation on a stool test because mold especially is a big immunosuppressive biotoxin. It will wreak havoc in the body. It will set the stage in the gut for multiple co-infections, multiple pathogens to move in and proliferate. And in fact, in this particular case, she had already confirmed with this first practitioner she had seen, the functionally trained medical doctor, that she had had mold toxicity, mold exposure. And this was something that we considered as we moved forward to continue to work on. We didn't necessarily go and retest that to confirm that because from my experience, mold can take a very long time to get down to I would say small to minuscule levels in the body. And there's no harm in making a healthy assumption that this is part of the equation and just considering that as part of the plan as we move forward. So I'm putting that out there just as kind of like a practitioner view as I look at this test. And then in her intestinal health section, you can see that the thing that's really sticking out here is under immune response, she's got low secretory IgA, which is actually quite common with this type of picture. Secretory IgA is an indicator of how robust the immune system is in the gut. We want it to be kind of in the sweet spot. And you can see the range over here to the right that Diagnostic Solutions has designated on their stool test We don't want it too low. We don't want it too high. And I see a good amount of GI maps that have either low or high secretory IgA. Not always, but generally, when secretory IgA is low like this, again, that would kind of indicate to me, okay, with all of these co-infections, we likely could have mold going on. But then secondarily, just having a number of different pathogens proliferating does take a toll on the immune system. And so anytime the body is fighting infections, multiple infections for a long time, it's more likely to deplete immune function and also bring secretory IgA down. So this all made sense in the context of her GI map and gave us a really awesome starting point for just gathering data and trying to establish what's going on. And then from this, I can obviously write her a plan and give her an estimated timeline that I feel is reasonable to see improvement in her health. And granted, this is just one test of potentially 2 or 3 we might run. But this is a really great test in terms of just looking at the gut. Let me show you another tool that I use with all of my clients. I tend to use this actually as part of my initial consult to give me a really good baseline read on what I believe is their 3 biggest areas of kind of healing opportunity before we launch into testing, and to help me approximate, all right, if we're going to do tests, which tests make the most sense for them? Where do I think they're going to get the best bang for their buck and investment in testing? How many tests should we order? Which tests should we order? And this is the same client. I'm showing you her nutrition assessment questionnaire symptom burden graph results. Comparatively. So the first one was done in April, and that's the line in orange. And then the one that she took again in October, so roughly about 6 months apart, just to show you how much change and how much improvement she had. And now keep in mind that this is a client who's got a number of things going on, likely is going to be on a track to heal her body naturally for potentially 6 to 18 months. I mean, we were 6 months in at this point, and you can see there's still opportunity for her here. But really, what I want to point out to you is you can see huge improvement in the first 4 columns, which are the digestive system. And I always explain to clients these first 4 columns are foundational. They are foundational for everyone. And if I see medium to high priority scores on the symptom burden graph from the NAC in the digestive system, I know that's absolutely where we have to start. And for anything, to the middle and right side of this graph to improve, we need to have a healthy GI. And so there's a bit of a hierarchy, order of importance here. And generally, when I start working with a client, I'm going to expect the highest amount of improvement in the gut first, especially if we're finding pathogens, we're finding imbalances, and we're really going after those. And you can see on her symptom burden graph, that is where the vast improvement is coming from. I mean, she's got improvement, I would say, in most of these areas. And this might not look mind-blowing to you, but I'm telling you, when upper GI goes from high to low priority, that's a huge felt difference for a client. Same thing with liver and gallbladder going from medium to low. In fact, across her GI, almost everything is in the low priority, and her large intestine didn't really move. She was doing okay there from the first test to the second. And small intestine's right on the cusp of, low to medium. So we've brought her GI from a overall medium high priority range down to low in 6 months, which is awesome. Now, obviously, some of these scores jumped up a little bit, and this is pretty typical on a symptom burden graph. I always tell clients, healing isn't linear. There's going to be certain things that you might see improve, or you might see periods of time where it feels like the body's going backwards, and then you might have a jump and something really feels better for a while. That's normally just how it goes. I always say that the body is always working on something in the background, and sometimes we can't see the actual change point until it's manifested itself, which can take time. And as certain things get better, sometimes there's a little bit of a setback, or other layers of work revealed in other areas. So for her, there was a little bit of a change the other direction for minerals and for fatty acids. But again, this is a pretty common thing I see on sugar handling came down, vitamin need came down, adrenals came down, although there's obviously still, this is probably the area along with pituitary That is still the remainder of the majority of the work that needs to be done. The other thing that's pretty significant here is female reproductive, which is her sex hormones, came down quite a bit. And it wasn't initially a super big problem in the sense that it was kind of on the cusp of low to medium, but again, we're seeing a good jump in terms of improvement. So, I kind of put over here to the right just subjectively what she reported back to me at the time of her second nutrition assessment questionnaire. And she said, I don't need to go home and take naps anymore in the afternoon. She was self-employed, so she had some flexibility in her schedule, but it's a big deal to have to take time out to nap because it's lost work hours. And so, in a sense, her productivity went up, her energy got much better. She started to have an appetite in the morning and noticed that she could keep food down. She was able to actually start to connect on some level. There was a relationship between her morning symptoms and feelings of stress and anxiety. Not that the stress and anxiety explained everything going on with her in the morning, but she was more intuitively able to discern, like, okay, this actually does impact, and I need to maybe put some strategies in place for myself in the morning to try to mitigate that, to support the healing efforts. And this is actually the advantage of doing an actual program with a practitioner, which is what I do with all of my clients, is that built into the program, I'm not just teaching them and tweaking their diet and giving them very customized recommendations or writing them, a protocol with supplements to address hidden infections in the GI map. I'm literally teaching them skills on how to regulate, rebalance their nervous system, develop mindfulness. I even bring in my colleague Miles Trainer to help them learn to understand at a deeper level what their nervous system is telling them, in a sense. And all of these things kind of play out differently person to person, but it's amazing to see the light bulbs go off when they do for my clients, because this I feel is something highly underrated in functional medicine, but I feel is just as important as the testing and the nutrition, is really giving clients skills and developing stronger intuition to read their bodies and intuitively grasp, like, what's not serving me and what might be connecting to some of these symptoms I'm having. So this definitely happened for her by that 6-month mark, which was really awesome for me to see. And then the last big thing that was, huge for her was the brain fog was gone. And I could actually tell as we would meet for monthly sessions, conversation flowed better. She seemed much more able to kind of complete thoughts and track with what was going on. It was like, the light was kind of coming on, and, she was starting to feel, I think, more like herself. So, this is what I wanted to share with you today in terms of my first client case. Not that this is like representative of everybody coming through the door, but this is fairly good representation of what I work with on a regular basis. And it definitely has the GI background, had the mold toxicity background, had some of the autoimmune background, thyroid and sex hormone dysregulation. So, checking a lot of boxes in terms of systems and symptoms that could be impacted. And so I'm hoping that this was valuable for you. I'm hoping that some of these symptoms resonate with some things you're going through, and start to give you some insight on, how would I look at this as a functionally trained practitioner? How does functional medicine approach these types of things just in general? Obviously, this isn't the complete gamut of all the tests I ran, but gives you a really nice idea, at least from the stool test, of kind of how I looked at this case and started her down a path of feeling much better. And she's actually a number of months now past this 6-month mark and continues to improve, which has just been so awesome for me to see. I just want to put it out there that I do offer a free gut check Zoom call, which is 20 to 30 minutes. It's an opportunity to sit down with me one-on-one. If you just really want to connect and want some validation on what you're struggling with, and at least get my thoughts on, what would I do next? Is this something I could potentially help you with? Just sometimes it's good to have that other perspective and be able to touch base. And This is whether you've already worked with a functionally trained practitioner or whether you haven't and this is all new to you and you're just kind of like, well, I don't really know. Maybe this is something that would work. I just feel hesitation. I really want to encourage you to take advantage of that because, you know, from my perspective, you've got nothing to lose. And there's been plenty of clients I've sat with who I think have gotten value out of it, but then decided, okay, like I'm going to need to continue on my own down the path I'm on, which is perfectly fine. But it is always the starting point for everyone I've essentially gone to work with, and you know, whether it was Melissa or my other clients. So I did want to put that out there just as a reminder. And did you find this episode informative and helpful? I'd love to have you leave me a 5-star rating. Do you have questions about holistic approaches to optimizing gut health that you'd like to ask? Please leave your question or comment below and I will be sure to address it personally or cover it in a future episode. Be sure to check the show notes for any resources mentioned in today's episode. See you next time.